Like any exhibition or most, the exhibition here began with a catalog, and that gives us an opportunity to research the objects, to write about them, which we can then use in writing labels, and also to suggest the narrative flow, both of the catalog and then the exhibition. Because just like a book, an exhibition has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So with Jewels of the Nile, we had an introduction talking about Mrs. Mars and Howard Carter and how they met and how Carter corresponded with her and advised her on her purchases. And then we went into the history of Egyptian jewelry, and then finally kind of thematic things at the end on cosmetics and funerary objects. Again, following the catalog largely, although you don't have to follow it religiously. Hi, I'm Peter Lacovara, and this is the Jewels of the Nile exhibit in the Worcester Art Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts. And the exhibition runs from June 18th, 2022 to January 2023. And the exhibition covers a collection of material that had been formed by Laura Norcross Morse, who was a Boston Brahmin and who had gone to Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century as a tourist. And while there, she met Howard Carter. She was interested in collecting prints and watercolors, and Carter, of course, had been the son of a famous landscape painter in England, Samuel Carter, and here we have a wonderful self-portrait of Samuel with the young Howard on his lap. And in the years before Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, he supplemented his income by painting watercolors to sell for the tourists, scenes of tombs and temples. And so he painted these, and Laura Norcross bought 6 of them for the Worcester Art Museum. So they have a particularly large collection. She also bought other watercolors as well. This painting is of Daryl Bachry by Erskine Nicholl, who was an English painter and the father of Mary Leakey. Under Carter's guidance, Laura Mars also bought jewelry, particularly and as well as small objects. Some of this she had reset into stick pins and brooches. And so here we have some examples, including the famous mummy beads that had been made out of mummy nets that were particularly popular for tourists to buy. And here we have an exploration of some of the raw materials and objects that jewelry and objects were made from. And a video showing how scarabs were made from the Getty. And she had a large collection of scarabs as well as other items of jewelry, including scarabs made of all sorts of material: gold, carnelian, amethyst, feldspar, rock crystal, hematite, as well as faience and glazed steatite, as well as amulets. And this section of the exhibit shows the history of Egyptian jewelry from the pre-dynastic and Old Kingdom on through the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom and the late and Greco-Roman periods, as well as funerary material from the Roman period, such as this child coffin. And this mummy portrait showing a woman wearing pearl earrings and jewelry and legs from a lion bear. And the image, of course, of the god Osiris. And She also collected cosmetic vessels, so we have a wonderful group here from the Middle Kingdom, including these anhydrite vessels, and from the New Kingdom and the late period. And then in addition to cosmetics in this educational area here, we have a display on ancient Egyptian perfume that contains some of the elements that went into Egyptian perfume that people can actually smell. And little videos that people can try on. They can actually virtually try on some of the jewelry in the exhibition, as well as an area with books and materials that people can handle, some 3D printed enlargements of some of the objects in the show, as well as raw materials, and a timeline and discussion of Egyptian history to orient people.
Hello, my name is Sarah Gillis at the Worcester Art Museum. I am the Associate Registrar for Collection Documentation. That's a mouthful. My involvement in this exhibition started very early on. We had a massive checklist to start with. It evolved a lot. And really the biggest challenge was making sure that everything was accounted for. As the exhibition evolved, we had different sections, objects that kind of fell into multiple sections, and really just staying on top of a ever-evolving checklist and make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. The more interesting side was as we were kind of getting closer to installation, where we had to really lock in and make sure that everything that was designated for a display case was available and accounted for that display case. What I found most effective was to actually take a rolling storage cabinet, a little like counter height cabinet. And because there are 309 objects in this exhibition that are all teeny tiny, it was easier and more efficient to designate each display case as its own drawer. So effectively, I was putting each object in its own display case in a drawer, so when we came to do this actual display case, it was just open the drawer, take the tray of the objects out, and we were good to go. This worked out actually pretty well, and I can safely say that all 309 objects are accounted for. And it actually was a pretty efficient process, which I think really helped speed up installation. There's really never a set timeline for when we have to get it done. We just want to make sure they're in and they're safe, but definitely taking that extra time to allocate a storage cabinet, to triple check and triple inventory the entirety of the show, worked out. One of the earlier sides of planning this exhibition involved accessing the primary donor's archival holdings. When we received the gift in 1924, we were really beneficial in also obtaining all of her paperwork. She kept everything, all the receipts from the purchases her husband made, correspondences. It really helped with the enormity of the collection. It's not just the Egyptian objects that Mrs. Kinswell-Mars gave us. It was works on paper, lots of decorative enamel cases, but obviously the real big gem is this ancient holding. So in addition to tracking the objects in the show, another aspect of what I do here at the museum is help manage the archives. So I worked closely with Peter to make sure that whatever was Egyptian related was accessible, because this was a very critical case to kind of ground the narrative for the exhibition. So the papers themselves, from an archival standpoint, it wasn't a designated collection, so we made it one, which helped us to then start to be able to track in our database the different archival documents that were being pulled for display. So Once all of that material was gathered, we could then transfer it to paper conservation for assessment, stabilization, and it results in this nice little spread of material from Mrs. Mars, and it's really helped strengthen the show. It shows her early tracking of the objects. This little address book she turned into a little notebook for the various scarabs. And in the very first page is a carnelian head, and it made complete sense for us to put the same exact carnelian head in the collection on display next to it to really help ground the contact between the documents and the actual objects themselves.
Hi, my name is Paula Artal-Isbrand. I'm Objects Conservator here at the Worcester Art Museum, and I wanted to tell you a little bit and talk a little bit about my role in this wonderful exhibition of Egyptian jewelry. It's a museum exhibition, so a lot of different people and colleagues and professionals were involved in the process. And I was part of it right from the beginning. As soon as our curators determined what pieces in the museum collection they wanted to exhibit and provided an object list, that's what we call it in the museum, they were turned over to me, these lists, so that I could then start thinking about the conservation process, which would involve looking at every single one of these objects and determining what their condition is and what they needed, and so that these objects could be presented in their absolute best condition for our public to enjoy. Our conservation department at the Worcester Art Museum has 5 people. It's 5 of us. We represent 3 different specialties: paper conservators, paintings conservators, and objects conservators work together. And this exhibition also contains some paper objects and some paintings. So my colleagues, they were part of it also. But as you see, most of the objects are 3-dimensional. And so I worked probably on a little over 100 pieces of, I think there are several hundred objects on exhibit here. So that was just an absolute delight to be able to work on so many pieces. And the conservation process of these objects, or this group of objects in particular, pretty much involved 3 different activities. On one hand, I did a lot of restringing of necklaces. A lot of the assemblages of the beads and the necklaces were not ancient. They were assemblages that were put together not by archaeologists, but by people and vendors and antiquities dealers that were offering these goods at the time to tourists. Of course, nowadays you cannot buy these ancient treasures anymore on the street. But so a lot of these necklaces were not assembled correctly according to ancient taste, and that we only know from documentation from scientific excavations that only started like in the late 19th century and 20th century. And so based on the photographs that we have from archaeologists that excavated very systematically and very carefully and took photographs of everything, those are the documents that we use and our curators use for then relate that information to me, and then for me to restring a lot of these necklaces according to ancient taste and style. So that was one of the aspects that I did. The other aspect was to clean a lot of these objects because they had never been displayed. A big majority of them had never been displayed since the generosity of the Marses, since we received these objects from the Marses. And so they lingered in storage for almost a century. And so what I did was I looked at their condition, and anything that was still dirty or from handling, I embarked on a cleaning campaign. But as I did this, I had to be very careful, because as a conservator, you want to make sure that you distinguish between modern and ancient. All of these objects are archaeological, right? So you don't want to remove anything that belongs in the original context of these objects, such as soil, such as contents. For example, we have this wonderful group of ancient cosmetic containers and implements, and believe it or not, some of them still contain their ancient contents, the makeup, the coal, not a lot, but residues. And sometimes it's not evident to the naked eye, although some of these do have very visible contents, very exciting. But so as a conservator, you do want to make sure that you distinguish between ancient and modern. By modern soil, I mean these objects, since they were excavated, have been handled, they got dirty from grease from hands, or maybe they were not packed in Kleenex, but rather dirty newspapers, right? And so all that post-excavation dirt is what we look to remove. I also engaged a little bit, although not too much, because things were in really good condition, in conservation restoration treatments. And restoration means that if an object is not complete and needs some tender loving care, like for example, this beautiful group of glass objects were partially fragmentary, and they were just not presentable. For example, if you look at this center flask here, you can see the front lip on the top has a slightly different color of green, and it was missing. That little area was missing. And or if you look at this beautiful little flask on the bottom here, it was missing parts of its legs. And so I did, these were really the only, or one of very few objects that I engaged in actual restoration. And I used your typical conservation grade materials that nowadays we use in a lab. Everything has been scientifically researched so that there is no interaction between ancient material and the modern material that I now associate with the ancient flasks in this case. In this case, I used epoxies that were tinted. As conservators get engaged in our conservation treatments, we spend so much time and such intimate time with these objects that as we look at them and study them in preparation of the treatment, we also find interesting aspects that teach us about how they were made, the technologies that were used to fabricate them, the materials that were chosen by the ancient artisans for these objects in particular. And I would like to lead you to one of the objects that then I decided to do a little more research into. And let's walk over to it. One of the objects that intrigued my curiosity further was this little object. It's an amulet, and it's an amulet made out of jasper, and it depicts the goddess Hathor, the goddess of music in art. And it looked odd to me. It just didn't look like it was finished. And indeed, it really is a sketch of a little amulet, of a little sculpture that was left unfinished. And that always is very intriguing to conservators because you wonder why. And because it's not finished, objects like this help you understand oftentimes technology, how they were made, because there are still tool marks left behind, or because there are some signs on it that tell you why they were not finished. In this case, if you walk around the object and focus on the top of it, you can see that it's fragmentary, that it's broken. And what happened was that it broke during the hole making, the hole drilling of it. And in antiquity, holes were drilled from both sides using flint as an abrasive to get through to the holes, and the two holes would meet in the middle. In this case, they didn't. And the process of drilling the hole veered sideways and led to this little, the top of this head to break off. And that was the end of the process of finishing this piece. The artisan put the piece aside and forgot about it. Another specialty in conservation are conservation scientists. And conservation scientists are the professionals who go even more into depth with research and trying to understand materials and technology. And I wanted to show you one piece in this exhibition, this beautiful brooch that was fastened or was placed in a modern frame. Modern meaning early 20th century. It's very Art Nouveau-ish, right? That was the taste of the time. But the little plaquette that you see in the center is an ancient. It's a very ancient piece, plaquette made out of steatite that is glazed, and it belongs to the very early part of the ancient Egyptian history. I believe it's from the Archaic period. And what was noticed was that the material and the aspect of it under the microscope was very interesting because it looked like it had a glazing on it, and glass was not really a material that was used in 2,000-3,000 BCE. And so we decided to hire, invite a collaborator who was a conservation scientist. And it was a team, Aaron Meisak and Richard Newman from the MFA, who took this object, or we accompanied it to the MFA conservation scientific lab, and they did in-depth analysis of the material and determined that it was glazed steatite, which is a very unusual technique that is found occasionally in Egyptian art, and this is an example of that. So this may give you an idea of the role of a conservator and her or his engagement in an exhibition like this. An exhibition takes a long time to prepare, from the time its idea or its inception as an idea. In our case, it was like 2-3 years in the making, and everybody was involved in it at one time or another. But conservation really becomes part of it early on, because we work slowly and deliberately, and so we have to make sure that everything that is in need of treatment and cleaning and studying will be finished by the time the actual installation occurs. So maybe I hope that this helped you understand a little bit of what the role of a conservator is in an exhibition like this one. Thank you.
So my name is Michele Rushfeldt, and I'm the Chief Preparator here at Worcester Art Museum. I actually just started here about a month ago, right before we began installing this exhibition. And so I kind of walked into a trial by fire, as Peter would put it, with this just kind of landing and starting to install immediately, not having seen a lot of these objects before. So there was a lot of troubleshooting of the initial design and kind of manipulating it to see what would work with a lot of these objects. So, you know, I feel like after having been an art handler and worked in galleries and museums and an artist myself for years, this was one of the most extensive shows that I've ever had the pleasure of working on and installing, and with the widest variety of objects, absolutely. So it was a really interesting experience for me, figuring out how everything needed to be mounted, working with our mount maker to lift some of these objects off of the decks, as well as doing a lot of pinning and stabilizing of objects. As you'll see, we can go through, you can see some of these mounts here. And also just working with curators on which objects needs to go where, how things need to be switched around, and how things needed to be lit. The lighting of this show was actually particularly interesting because we really wanted to highlight the cases and make a lot of the other areas darker in order to kind of make it feel more tomb-like, more like ancient Egypt. So you can see that some of these walls are kind of a little bit dimmer, and then the cases are really nice and bright. So that really allows you to highlight the objects as much as possible without having any sort of distracting bright lights on any of the walls around. This is another really good example of how lifting some of these objects off of the deck with mounts really kind of differentiates them from the objects that are pinned to the deck. There was a lot of pinning in this exhibition, and so basically we just had to take pins, prepare them, and then get everything pinned so that it looks as nice as possible on these decks and isn't going to move anywhere, because that's the last thing anybody wants. So that was a lot of the installation of this exhibition, was using pins and then getting everything, all the labels situated, everything straight, clean, and then getting these cases prepared and cleaned and putting them on. So, you know, let's see, oh yeah, this was a particularly interesting one because our preparators actually created this base for this obelisk to represent the base that has been lost. And it apparently looks similar to the original base, and that was the goal for the curators, is to not have it be distractingly different. So that was kind of a fun project for us. Let's see. Oh yes. So with regards to the pinning of all these objects, you know, all of these scarabs had to be individually pinned in a way that you really need to try to hide the pins as much as possible, since they're so small that, you know, seeing the pins, seeing the way that they're installed can be distracting for viewers. So that was, you know, something that we had to kind of troubleshoot on the spot and figure out how to do. And it ended up looking really great. So I can't take credit for the design on these. Those were, you know, designed by the curators. So it looks fantastic. Oh, this is a pretty good example of how you can see the sort of dramatic tomb-like lighting that we decided to go with that kind of gives it that, you know, ancient Egypt drama, I guess is what you want. And then you can see all the little sparkles on it then. Yeah. And some of these objects are in our permanent collection here at Worcester Art Museum. So we were lucky enough just to be able to kind of move the cases, you know, and then put the objects back in them on site. So, you know, these ones were a little bit more self-explanatory, which made it a little easier. It wasn't quite as much pinning as some of the other things as well here. So these are in our permanent collection.